Well, hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Wright. This is going to be my review and critique on the book Extreme Ownership. Thank you for taking a look at it, and I hope you enjoy it. Um, Part of the rubric in this says in the introduction, to establish yourself as knowledgeable about leadership. Well, I always feel like I'm learning about leadership, and hopefully that as I learn, I continue to grow as a leader. I do have experience as a leader, a supervisor in my department. I've got 20 years with the Austin Police Department, and in that time, I've had the opportunity for about 8 to 10 of those years to be in some type of leadership role within the department, either as a supervisor over officers or in the training academy as an instructor. And one of the things that I did as an instructor was teach classes on leadership to our officers. So I really enjoy the subject of leadership, and getting into this particular leadership and development class. I think was very beneficial, and I've enjoyed it so far. And hopefully, you guys will enjoy this critique of the book that I chose for to read this semester. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get into it. So the book I chose was Extreme Ownership: How U.S. Navy SEALs Lead and Win. This book was written by two former Navy SEALs, Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. And there you see the citation for the book at the bottom, Willink, J, and Babin L. This book was written in 2017. Extreme Ownership: How U.S. Navy SEALs Lead and Win. Second edition, New York, St. Martin's Press. There are a couple of different covers for the book. This was the one that is the cover of the book that I have, but I know that there's a couple of different covers out there. So if you see the book Extreme Ownership and this doesn't look like it, you still kind of want to make sure that it was written by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin if you look to pick it up somewhere down the road. Excuse me. There's the intro. Introduction into this book. What was the intention and the scope? Well, the intention behind this book was to present leaders with key principles to succeed under any given circumstances. And the book's scope specifically is centered around leadership in the military, however, and how those military leadership principles presented can be applied at higher levels of leadership within an organization or a company. Additionally, there are portions of the book that addresses leadership at every level. So this doesn't just apply to leaders at the top of an organization. It applies to leaders at every level. So I like the way that the book kind of went into that as well. The language for the book it's very suitable for graduate study. The authors, do use some potentially unfamiliar military terms to people, but however, they explain those pretty well. However, those terms that they use are pretty innocuous to the overall leadership principles presented. The question that I really hoped this book would answer was whether or not the principles presented would be, different or, from other books that I've read on leadership or the training I've attended on leadership. And I think it was, answering that particular question. I do believe that there was some principles here that were a little bit different, and maybe approached in a different way. I think the author's work is relevant to the topic of leadership in general, and I found some very, very good takeaways from this book that we'll discuss later. Now into the summary. As far as a thesis or kind of the overall theme of the book, obviously the authors contend in this book that military leadership principles that were presented can translate directly from the combat field to the boardroom. How are these main points presented? They break the book down into three sections. The first section is the war within, which addresses intrinsic principles, which there's four total there. The laws of combat is the second section, and that addresses strategies on how to address both simple and complex issues that leaders may face. And the last section of the book is called Sustaining Victory, and that gives strategies for maintaining success. Overall, there's 12 chapters, and there's 12 leadership principles that are presented in the book. Each part of the book has 4 chapters. I think the author's findings are that military leadership principles can translate directly to the civilian world, and they can lead to the same success. The methodology throughout the book, in each chapter, they break it down into 3 sections. They present a story from their combat experience, then that addresses the particular principle for that chapter. Then they address the principle itself specifically and how that principle will work. And then lastly, they present a scenario from a corporation or organization where that principle was utilized to kind of lead to success. So that's kind of the basic overall summary of the book. But now I'm going to get into the specifics. We'll get into the critique of the book. And with that, here we go. So what are the author's frame of reference? Well, here you have a picture of Jocko Willink and Leif Babin when they were in the U.S. Navy as Navy SEALs. This is probably around 2006, 2007, and they were, Jocko Willink was the unit commander for Task Unit Bruiser in Ramadi, and Leif Babin was one of his platoon commanders. So both of them have extensive experience in leading teams in very highly stressful situations. And their intention with this book was to demonstrate how those military leadership techniques they learned could be applied in any organization. So when you talk about values in this book, which values were evident, and if were there any biases evident, one of the greatest values that I saw demonstrated in this book was one of self-accountability, and that's really what extreme ownership encompasses. Jocko says that the leader must own everything in his or her world. And he explains it before that a leader can truly understand why their team or organization isn't succeeding. They have to be willing to look at themselves in the mirror. Every principle that follows from the book, because the extreme ownership principle is the first principle addressed, and everything that follows really kind of flows from that initial principle. I didn't really see any biases present in this book that I was able to identify. The one theme that I sensed throughout the book was that leaders shouldn't blame external factors for their shortcomings. One of the things that I love that Jocko mentioned in this book was that the enemy always gets a vote. And what this meant for him was that on the battlefield, that no matter how well they were prepared for mission, they could never account for the actions of the enemy, those external factors. The one thing that they could do was plan for these contingencies and be prepared should they arise. So for me, the same principle applies to leadership. Leaders must understand that the enemy always gets a vote. They have to understand that there are external factors that are going to present themselves, and leaders should find ways to prepare and mitigate for those contingencies. So is the language clear and appropriate? Is the style appropriate? So yeah, the language is very clear. Any of those military specific terms that are utilized throughout the book are explained well, and as I stated earlier, they're pretty innocuous, but they are explained. The style of the book, as I stated earlier, is that each chapter is broken into 3 parts. So in the first part of the chapter, Jocko or Leif will talk about an experience that they had in the battlefield, either in Ramadi or while they were training SEALs or training as SEALs in San Diego, California. And each of those stories is there's a very challenging scenario that's presented. I think it's interesting to note, and just here real quick, in those battlefield stories in the book, a couple of them mentioned Chris Kyle, who wrote the book American Sniper. He was a part of Task Unit Bruiser, the unit that Jocko Willink was over. And so after that first part of the chapter where they address that battlefield scenario where they utilize the leadership principle, the next part of the chapter discusses the application of that principle, the principle itself. What was that principle, whether it be extreme ownership, check your ego, cover and move, whatever the leadership principle was, they address it in the second part of the chapter. And the last part of the chapter is a story or experience that Jocko or Leif had while working with their business, Echelon Front, which is a leadership consulting firm, where they would go out to organizations and businesses and corporations and kind of coach and mentor people on leadership. And they would use those stories at the end of the chapter to kind of demonstrate how the leadership principle from the military applied to the real world and could lead to success. So does the organizational structure of the book promote or hinder understanding? So I think the structure of the book really promotes understanding. I think it's done it's done very well. It's very simple to understand. I've read several books, or I've read a lot of books on leadership, and I have the picture of the book Crucial Conversations here. And the reason I put that picture there was because Crucial Conversations is probably one of the easiest books I've read on the subject of leadership. Now, while it addresses conversations, it does really speak about leadership and how to have those conversations to kind of help move a difficult situation forward. And I think that's really crucial in leadership. But Crucial Conversations was a very easy read, very, very practical, gave you step-by-step kind of instructions on how to address certain situations. And so to me, that was probably one of the easiest books I've read on leadership. Extreme Ownership, on the other hand, while it is an easy read, There weren't really a lot of the practical applications. There was more just kind of demonstrations on how the principles could work outside of the military battlefield. Are the transitions clear on the whole? Is the book coherent? Absolutely. So as I discussed earlier, you've got part 1, part 2, and part 3 of the book, and this illustration shows what those parts, kind of what I explained those parts were. And under each of those parts, you have a principle of leadership addressed. So under part 1, you've got extreme ownership, no bad teams, only bad leaders, believe, and check the ego. Under part 2, you've got cover and move, simple, prioritize and execute, decentralized command. Part 3, you've got plan, leading up and down the chain of command, decisiveness amid uncertainty, and discipline equals freedom, the dichotomy of leadership. So while some of these terms may appear militaristic in nature, they're really explained well on how on what they mean when they apply these to leadership roles outside of the military. So I thought they did a very good job of breaking the book down. It was transitioned really well, and the book really flowed very well throughout the entire thing. So is there consistency between this work and other materials on the topic? So here specifically, I wanted to address the consistencies that I found between extreme ownership and our text for this class, Leadership Theory and Practice. So specifically, I could see connections between extreme ownership and a lot of the traits that were presented in our textbook of transformational leadership, authentic leadership, and servant leadership. I felt like the main idea behind extreme ownership was having a high level of humility, and I felt like when I read transformational leadership, authentic leadership, and servant leadership, that seemed to be a common theme among those three theories, was having a level of humility to kind of really be genuine with your people. Additionally, there were a lot of principles in the book that addressed the trait, skills, behavior, and situational approaches to leadership. And I think it's fair to say that from the book, there were certain traits and skills that are expected of leaders, that being intelligence and self-confidence, obviously. And it was also important for leaders in the book Extreme Ownership to have technical skills and career experiences of the job while coupling that with the ability to communicate with their people. Now, every battlefield story that presented a leadership principle dealt with a specific situation, and those situations, a lot of times you would see Jocko or Life dealing, handling things through delegation, through supporting, through coaching, and through directing. You would see traits from the team leadership model or at least I would see traits from the team leadership model that were also presented in this book, both internal and external leadership actions, some of which were like maintaining standards, collaborating, and networking. One of the topics that really wasn't covered in the book was gender and leadership. There was a little bit about culture and leadership, but nothing specifically addressed. Obviously, being in Ramadi and being in a leadership leadership role, Willink and his unit, they had to work with Iraqi soldiers that fought alongside U.S. soldiers to help stabilize the region. There were some issues that were addressed in the book, such as kind of different fighting tactics of the Iraqis, but nothing that was overtly addressed. One of the things I also found interesting was in the latter part of the book, Sustaining Victory, it addressed a chapter specifically called Leading Up and Down the Chain of Command. Now, to me, this was similar to leader-member exchange theory and the dyadic relationship between the leader and the followers. I don't really believe there was an in-group, out-group in this particular book, at least none that was demonstrated or overtly demonstrated. I think the reason for that is because when you're working in a unit like this, and in a situation where you're facing life and death situations every day, everybody should be a part of the in-group, and you should be able to communicate well with each other and have a pretty highly cohesive unit. So those were some of the similarities I saw between the books. I didn't really notice anything that was that kind of contradicted each other. So I think they kind of work well together if we were kind of to compare and contrast the two. Recommendation: what did I hope to get out of this book, and what surprised me? So, obviously I was hoping to get some tools for my leadership toolbox, and I think that expectation was met. Only thing that really surprised me was in the latter chapters of, the last portion of the chapters, where they have the application to businesses, where they would present situations with organizations and such. The dialogue in those chapters just really, it felt kind of flat. I don't know if the authors were just kind of trying to remember what that dialogue was like, or if they were kind of making it up just to kind of give an illustration. but the dialogue there kind of fell flat. But it was, it was the principle presented was demonstrated to work in outside of the military. So that kind of it hit there, but the dialogue kind of fell flat on the back part of the chapters for me. Aside from that, there were really no other surprises that I found in the book. What are my own values on this subject? Do they align with what I believe the authors to be? And at what points do they diverge? So I think my values align very much with this book. I try not to blame external factors for my shortcomings. To me, that's an easy way to defer blame from my shortcomings. For instance, I know that I'm overweight. It's not society's fault I'm overweight. It's not the media's fault I'm overweight. It's not the TV's fault I'm overweight. I am overweight because I eat poorly and don't exercise. It's my fault. I didn't get a position I applied for within my department. Well, what can I do to improve myself to make sure I have a better chance of getting that position next time? It's easy to hold a mirror up to somebody else, and I believe it's also easy to kind of have somebody hold that mirror up for us and have us kind of look at ourselves. I think it's more difficult to take the mirror yourself and hold it and look into that. And I think that's where the real growth comes from, is when we choose to take a look at what our shortcomings are and how we can make ourselves better. I like the illustration here of the cat and the lion. A lot of times we'll be the cat and we'll look into the mirror and we're wanting to see the lion, but in reality, we're really the cat, and what do we need to do to transform ourselves from the cat into the lion? That's kind of the way I see it. Did I feel that the book, or how does it feel to challenge points in this work or to accept points in this work? I really didn't feel like there were any points that I needed to challenge in this book. Everything was kind of straightforward. A lot of things were addressed at the most basic level to leadership, so it was easy to understand and grasp the principles. The practical applications in the latter half or the latter third of the chapters, they were helpful, and see how we could utilize those principles. However, I've heard that this book that I have pictured here, Leadership Strategy and Tactics, the Field Manual by Jocko Willink, he just wrote it this year or released it this year. I hear this book is very good and that it actually gives you specific strategies for situations that leaders can face. I've talked to a couple of people in my department, and they said that's a necessary book to be on your bookshelf because it's easy to grab that book, say you're dealing with a problem employee, what's that particular problem you're dealing with, and here's the kind of way to deal with it. So probably trying to pick up this book in the near future. Does this piece make a contribution to the body of knowledge on this topic? Absolutely. And does it make a contribution to my own learning about leadership? Absolutely it does. It reinforced some principles and concepts that I was already aware of. It challenged and motivated me to be a better leader for my organization. And at the very least, it encouraged me to continue looking after my people, looking out for the best for them, which in turn hopefully looks out for the best of our organization. I use this picture. I've read not all of these books on here, but I've read a few of them. And I know that a lot of these are very well-renowned books in leadership. And I think Extreme Ownership really does earn a place in that list of leadership books that you should read. So yeah, I think it would make a contribution. It made a contribution to my learning about leadership, and I think it would do the same for you. Lastly, here it is, the references for this presentation. You see there's the Effective Police Leadership book. I don't recommend it. American Sniper, written by Chris Kyle. Obviously Chris Kyle was killed a few years ago or several years ago. But this book I was able to listen to the audiobook on it. It's a very good book, and I would recommend that one as well. There's our textbook for the class. Crucial Conversations is an excellent book. I would highly, highly recommend you read that. Principles are always from that book are always valuable. And the last two, Extreme Ownership and then Leadership Strategy and Tactics Field Manual by Jocko, and then Life Babin as well. I'm going to pick up Leadership Strategy and Tactics, but I would recommend Extreme Ownership for you. So that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this critique of Extreme Ownership. I look forward to your responses, and I encourage y'all to give me some, honest feedback. Hopefully, it will be something that you'll pick up and put in your library. But additionally, I would ask that if you guys have any recommendations for me, I'm always looking for books to read and ways to improve myself. So thanks for those recommendations, and thank you for taking the time to look at this. Y'all take care.